Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Scares That Shaped Us, a podcast about horror writers and the stories that made them. I'm your host, Matthew Jackson, and I am the 2025 Ghoul Master Champion. That's right, it's me. I won the trophy at Ghoulish Book Festival over the weekend. I competed in Ghoul Master, which is a game show similar to, but legally distinct from, the popular UK game show Taskmaster. I went into it not really knowing what to expect. The great Max Booth III was running the show, as they do with everything at the Ghoulish Book Festival. And we had been given a couple of hints as to what might be coming, but I kind of went into it thinking I'm going to meet some cool people. I'm going to have some fun. I'm going to try not to make too much of a fool of myself. And then I injured my knee midway through the competition. My knee is still sore, but we're hanging in there. And somewhere after that, that dog came out, y'all. I just decided, like, I gotta win this thing. I gotta make this count. And by 1 point, I was able to do that, and now have this fun little trophy for my office saying that I competed in Max's shenanigans and have something to show for it. But seriously, Ghoulish Book Festival was so much fun. I didn't get to be there for as long as I would have liked because of work stuff and a few other things, but I met some great people. I met a lot of people that I've known online for a while in person for the first time. I connected with some people who are going to be on future episodes of this show, so stay tuned for that. I spent way too much money on books. It was a fantastic time, and it was a reminder that we got to keep supporting these small horror presses, y'all. They do amazing work. They are run by amazing people. They put out some of the edgiest, most interesting, most daring horror stories you're going to find anywhere right now. And this is not to say that I don't love my big publishing house authors. I absolutely do, as anyone who listens to the show knows. But I'm going to make a concerted effort over the next few months to try to get more of these indie authors and small press authors on this show. I met people over the weekend like Alex Woodrow from Tenebrous Press, who slipped me a couple of really interesting arcs that I'm excited to check out. I met LP Hernandez from Sobello Books here in Texas. I met Chris Panettiere. I met a lot of amazing people. And yeah, it's just a reminder that the small presses are out there doing it for the love of the genre and turning in some amazing work. And we got to keep supporting those people. So my recommendation this week, after all that, is to say, go find a small press that you like, whose vibe you like, whose authors you like. Could be Ghoulish Books, could be Tenebrous Press, could be Little Ghost Books in Canada. Find their stuff, signal boost their stuff, buy a book from them. If you want a concrete recommendation on that, I'll tell you what I told LP Hernandez when I met him. No Gods, Only Chaos, his story collection that came out last year, is fantastic, and I love it, and I can't wait to read more of his stuff. There's also an amazing, super weird, super fun, short little book called Familiar by Jeremy C. Shipp that Ghoulish is putting out. A book called True Cult from Tenebrous that is a choose-your-own-adventure horror novel about a metal musician that's really, really fun. So any and all of those, go support small presses. We love them. Also, if you're looking for a movie to watch, I just revisited and wrote a piece for Dread Central about a film called A Dark Song, written and directed by a filmmaker named Liam Gavin. It is a wonderful piece of occult horror and grief horror and single location, or it almost entirely takes place in one house. So it's streaming a lot of different places. I'm pretty sure you can find it on Shudder right now. Go look it up. A Dark Song, great movie. That's enough of me. We have a great guest for you this week. Erika T. Wurth is here. We're going to talk to Erika about her new novel, The Haunting of Room 904, and we're going to talk about scary stories to tell in the dark. So let's head over to our interview with Erika T. Wurth. Joining Joining us this week on The Scares That Shaped Us is one of my favorite rising stars in horror. You will know her for her amazing debut novel, White Horse. Her latest book, The Haunting of Room 904, is in stores everywhere March 18th. Erika T. Wurth, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me.
It's my pleasure. I was telling you before we started recording that I'm not quite done with Haunting of Room 904, but I have been absolutely tearing through it at every opportunity. It's that kind of book. It moves. It is so much fun and at the same time so emotionally satisfying. For people who don't know, could you give our listeners a little taste of what Haunting of Room 904 is?
Yeah, I think the log line, if you will, for White Horse is a little bit easier, right? It's like, a woman who thinks her mother abandoned her when she was 2 days old, touches a bracelet, and her mother's ghost starts haunting her, and she has to find out what really happened to her. But the Haunting of Room 904, I've had to work to really boil down to a log line. And I guess the closest is, right, a woman with mysterious powers um, is charged to solve a paranormal crime in 3 weeks or her mother dies, right? And the longer log line, right, is that Olivia is she's getting her PhD in psychology. She's a lot like her father, who was a white dude and a scientist. And that's kind of where her beliefs lie. Her mother and her sister, even though her mother's a newspaper writer, they both believe in the paranormal. They believe they see ghosts and such. So when Olivia is graduating with her PhD, her sister, who's been in and out of rehab for drug abuse and is finally seeming to get better, calls her up and says, "Hey, if you don't come to the Brown Palace, I'm going to die." And she's like, "Calm down, come join me, get drunk." She hangs up the phone and she wakes up to what appears to be her sister's ghost. And lo and behold, it appears that her sister has committed suicide. And this turns all of her paranormal powers on, if you will. And she sees ghosts everywhere. It destroys her career. Her mother's distraught because she's just lost her husband to cancer a few years before. So she and her friend decide to start a paranormal investigator business. And the Brown Palace calls her like 5 years later and says, "We want you to solve this paranormal crime that happens every 5 years. A woman checks in, they reappear in room 904, and then they seem to commit suicide. And by the way, your sister is now haunting that room." And she says, "Absolutely not." And then her mother checks in, reappears in 904. So she has 3 weeks to solve the crime or her mother dies. So, yeah.
It is a book full of so many things that I love as a horror fan and a fan of just sort of occult esoterica in general. It has ghost hunting, it has Ouija boards and haunted dolls that you buy on eBay, all of these wonderful
Yes.
things. It also has which my father-in-law lives in the Denver area. He lives in Erie, so I go up to Denver quite a bit. I have not been to the Brown Palace, but the Brown Palace is a real place in Denver. What of all these elements coming together, what was kind of your way in? What started this book?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, like you, even though I haven't really experienced much in the way of the paranormal, I've always been a geeky kid. And so I love these kinds of like occult objects. I love objects of mysteries. And I'm always on eBay looking for haunted mirrors and, haunted dolls. And there's a whole paranormal section for it. Um, and I love like portals in general and just geeky things, right? But this particular novel, a lot of it was the Brown Palace. I grew up really 45 minutes west of it. And then, and it's this opulent, beautiful, like mansion like hotel, right? And everyone knows the rumors that it's haunted. So room 904 is supposedly haunted by this woman who was this, person in Denver who belonged to like this opulent society. And then she died in room 904. And so even when the room was being redone years ago, when there was no phone in the room, they were getting calls at the front desk from room 904. So I just loved that. But then on top of it, right, not, if you go further west, there's the Sand Creek Massacre. So these things are kind of happening at the same time. And as a person who's from Denver and a person of indigenous descent who grew up in Denver, like I can't help but think about these things at the same time all the time. So yeah.
So, how involved did you get? I'm always curious how much of this is tactile research and how much of it is I'm just making this up and having a good time. Did you do any of the kinds of things that Olivia is doing in this book? Did you go ghost hunting? Did you try seances? Did you play with all that stuff?
No, I had a friend who did that though, and I think I would have. I think I, for whatever reason, I probably was the kid who would be very, I did play Bloody Mary. I remember that. But I was the kid who would have played with the Ouija boards, but would have been very cynical about them. But I had a friend who she was totally, she was like my friend from high school, and she was totally a ghost hunter. And I have to admit, that was the first time in my life when she would go do this and she would play tapes and you could hear the people in the room who were there, like, and then you could hear another voice come in. And that was the first time in my life where I was like, Jesus, I mean, I know that's not like a scratching sound. That's not like a misinterpreted as a human voice sound. That is a human voice. And it is clearly not these four others. And plus, my friend really wanted to believe, right? So she's not going to try to fool me. That's just not how she works. So that was the first time in my life where I was like, this is really fascinating. My mother played with the Ouija boards. So as a kid, she and her mother were completely fascinated by this stuff, right? And it was the golden age of film horror. So yeah, but I did stay in room, not room 904 because it's very, very expensive, but I did stay in a room in the Brown Palace. Nothing was really scary there that I found. Honestly, the Stanley Hotel was much, much scarier. I stayed in a room there too. So
I have yet to stay at either of them. I need to cross those off my list at some point. We here in Austin, we have the Driscoll Hotel, but as far as I know, the
yeah.
haunting stories aren't quite as compelling as the Brown Palace. Did the staff at the Brown Palace ever know that you were working on this book and dropping their name and dropping Room 904 and stuff?
Yes, I actually, I did the, basic tour with everybody, but then they were really nice. They actually gave me a little personal tour of room 904. I told them that I'm working on a, very fictional novel. And like everybody, right, I started a research point and then eventually it just becomes more and more made up, right? Because I'm speculative, right? And it's more fun for me that way. But I did get a little tour of 904, which now I gave it a kind of a, gothic vibe, but really it's very modern looking. So yeah.
I don't want to confuse anyone. I want to make it clear to my listeners. Whitehorse and Haunting in Room 904 are very different stories, but they share certain thematic commonalities in that they are both stories about women navigating a very complex supernatural mystery that is both very family oriented and very history oriented. And you weave these things together very well. Do you come up with timelines or story maps or anything, outlines, anything to get you to where you need to be in terms of interweaving those things, or does it just sort of flow and then you clean it up draft after draft?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a question I like answering for a variety of reasons. Obviously, like, like I'm the person I am, I'm the writer I am. So themes are gonna, can hopefully like I have a style, I have a theme, I have an obsession, right? That every writer that I've always admired has, right? But I really want these stories to connect in the sense that, people are like, I really love White Horse. Hopefully I'll love 904. Hopefully I'll love the book I'm about to sell now, right? But they're very different characters and different, places. As to structure and plot, so I have a PhD in creative writing and literature, right? And I'm a creative writing professor. And in academia, God love them, they don't, for a variety of reasons, they don't generally much talk about story or structure or plot. In fact, oftentimes they think plot and structure are the same thing. And what they talk a lot about is language, and they're often like avant garde or lyrical or experimental or postmodern. Those are the things they value. And even though I valued story from the very beginning, I was in that environment. And so I really believed initially when I was writing like books, I was publishing with small presses. I published, more realism books. I like to call them instead of literary because I don't think that's, literary is not a genre. Genre is not a genre, right? I believed that. I believed you could just like, if you did your job with characterization, your plot should fall in line. And they were just disasters, really. And so, like and a lot of my colleagues were like, I don't know, you could take a screenplay writing class, right? And then I realized what I needed to do is go to the commercial writers that my peers had so, been so derisive of, right? I needed to look at Save the Cat Writes a Novel. And there are, people I know who have no sense of story structure will laugh about that book and they've never read it. I'm like, it tells you where to put the things, and then you can disagree if you want. But I just wanted to know where anybody would put any of the things and then maybe disagree if I wanted. So I use the beat sheet chapter. I've read Jane Cleland's Mastering Structure, Suspense, and Plot. I think it's fantastic. Chuck Wendig's Damn Fine Story. Chuck Palahniuk's craft book, the name of which I always forget. He talks about how to use clocks, red herrings. So does Jane Cleland. Ben Percy's Thrill Me. So these are things I take very seriously because I think that it's great if you're like, well, I'm anti-narrative. Okay, but why? Like, or I'm not doing the Hollywood arc. Okay, but why? And what is your structure then? And I think it's just because in academia and those circles, they align themselves with poetry because that's the first thing that became like, appreciated as an art form. Poetry is wonderful. I used to do it, but they're different forms. And I really respect structure and plot. Now, I always try to be like really linear, but as you can see in White Horse and in this one and in the next one, and probably the next one, I cannot help but like have other timelines invade and other points of view invade, because I think in the end I end up constructing something a little bit more complex.
So this is interesting. You mentioned literary not being a genre. White Horse, when it came out, was very much pushed as quote unquote literary horror. And
right.
Nothing wrong with calling something literary horror. I want to be clear from my end. But reading that book, that is, I mean, as you just described, that is a thumping, page-turning, commercially viable, straight up horror novel, and it works that way. And your prose is wonderful, and I love the literary elements of it. I'm just curious how you felt having approached fiction that way, like you just described, studying all of these forms and the way people approach plot and structure, and then having your sort of breakthrough book out and everyone said, oh, it's literary horror, it's literary horror. Do you embrace that label? Do you want to tweak it? How do you feel about it?
Yeah, number one, I think, like I said, literary isn't a genre any more than genre is a genre, right? So I think for some people, when they say literary, they mean topically very obtuse. So in other words, you're going to have intensely lyrical language and an anti-narrative structure. That to them is like that, and that's kind of the easy way to be literary, because when you read that stuff, it's hard to read, and you're like, gosh, this must be smart. And I don't think that's really necessarily true. I think literary is, whether it's, the subject matter of a cop or a, dying marriage, it's really three things. It's complex characterization, depth of theme, and attention to form and language. And to me, if you execute a traditional Hollywood arc really, really well, that's, you've achieved something that could be considered literary. I think for me, the writers that I most admire are probably, in terms of everything that they do, are people like Mallerman, Sylvia Moreno Garcia, and Grady Hendrix, because like David Lynch, their material, their content is really fucking weird, but their structure is extremely traditional. And so it allows them to, approach things that are like heavy thematically, and that would be where I put the word literary, right? Probably the most literary is something that approaches a concept that like is complex and has depth, but in such a way that's fun. And I, unlike many academics, I value fun. I value joy. I love the way thrillers are paced. I may not be exactly that guy, but it's part of why there was a crime aspect to my first two horror novels, because I love that kind of pacing. It just is really joyful and fun.
So, just as a brief aside, because I love all of those writers, but I'm like a big Mallerman nerd at the moment. Do you have a favorite Mallerman novel?
I did not. Well, the first thing that I knew about him was that he had written a dystopia. And I'm like so many people, like, I'm like, ugh, another dystopia. Oh my God. And there's a part of me that gets always annoyed with him because we are potentially facing that. So I feel like there need to be alternatives to, like, well, it's destroyed, but I'll have a lot of guns, like I hate that shit. And so I did not understand like how different Bird Box was. And when I read it, I was like, hot fucking damn. But then when I read Incidents Around the House, I have not stopped thinking about it. Now, this is a fairly what you might call right commercial book. But I love paranormal fiction. I love being scared. For me, this is a generalization I got in trouble with on Threads, but there's boy horror and there's girl horror. And girl horror is psychological and paranormal, and it scares you to your core because it's saying like, oh, what else is out there? And Jesus Christ, it could be something really terrifying to your core. Boy horror is like like gore horror. And I think like Stephen King is kind of both, right? He's a lot of girl horror. Mallerman is like 90% girl horror. So to be clear, in this silly distinction that I've made, like I don't think it's actually specific, generally speaking, to genders. But I think what I appreciate in horror is exactly what Mallerman is doing in Incidents Around the House, which is he profoundly frightens me. And he does it in such a simple way. And I kept asking myself over and over, like, how did he do it? And when I ask myself that, I know I've read something pretty masterful. So,
Yeah, we're big fans of Incidents Around the House over here. Scariest book I read last year by far, just masterpiece. Um, turning to another creative writing professor who lives in the Denver area and also has indigenous ancestry. Now, I don't make the whole podcast about Stephen Graham Jones, but he is a friend of the show, and you brought up that you teach writing and your approach to studying all these different sources and bringing them to bear on your own work. I'm curious because I know I've talked to him about this a lot, and it's fascinating to me as someone who never took creative writing classes. What do you, as a writer, get from your students, from your teaching? What does that part of your brain add to the actual composition when you sit down to work?
I think that, you know, when I was younger, especially, it allowed me an opportunity to, you know, have a gigantic think tank like over and over again, a very diverse one, a very different one every single semester, so that I could say, you know, well, I think this. And then I'd have two or three students be like, that's interesting. I wonder if that. So it's really helpful. But I think the older I get, the more that I try to be, to use the small power that I have to be an advocate so that they have the tools that they can use. Because I just like my issues with structure and plot. Like Stephen and I are very, very different. People have said, oh gosh, you guys are such similar writers. And I think they mean you're both Indians. You know what I mean? Although someone once said that we both have a quality to our prose that isn't dissimilar. And I do think that I mean, as somebody who's a scholar to some degree or another, right? I can tell you that Native American literature or Native American languages used to be much more verb centric versus noun. So I have noticed that a lot of natives, like even if they didn't grow up speaking, we do have an inherent way in which we approach metaphor that I do recognize. So I see that. But otherwise, Steve and I are very different. Like I do a beat sheet, I do a simple beat sheet, I do a beat sheet, and then I do a chapter by chapter, like one or two sentences in terms of what I'm going to write. Does that change radically? Yes, 5,000 goddamn times. Okay. But I need to do it because Stephen seems to accept like the postmodern ADHD, like, like writing like process. Like he's like, it's just going to go down. And then he'll say, I use those craft books as like a diagnosis. Like I write it. And then if it's not going the right way, I will diagnose and, you know, like, okay, do I have an effective catalyst? If I did that, the insanity that would ensue on the page and that did ensue on the page, like I just can't do that. I can't do that. Plus, I love traditional structure. And I'll tell you something about Stephen that's really, really funny. He's very, like, people see him as this axe wielding badass. He is just a geek. He is just a Star Trek geek. He and I have talked endlessly about Star Trek. And he's very naive in certain ways. And he's hilariously easily fooled. And so when he read White Horse to blurb it, he was like, oh man, I did not see that ending coming. Like he was just like blown away by something that was just essentially a couple of red herrings, right? So he values these things. He just, you know, it's just not his jam, you know, for his own writing. But yeah, yeah. So
Steven is a giant geek. I've never talked to him about Star Trek though. We have talked a lot about hair metal, which is
Okay.
also fun to nerd out about hair metal with Stephen Graham Jones. Which, by the way, not that it's not necessarily hair metal, but like last night at the gym, Megadeth came on my gym mix, and I was like, "Hey, I'm talking to Erika tomorrow," so that's fun.
Yeah. Pardon the
Um,
pun, but Steve and I both have hair metal roots. So
yeah. Okay, so moving on from that to our topic, I'm very excited because this is we've talked about it on the show before, but I feel like this is a wellspring of horror fandom and love for so many people that hit so many people in so many different ways. We're going to talk about Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, Alvin Schwartz's amazing anthology series of folk horror and urban legend and all manner of spooky things. Erika, when did you first experience Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, and what made you want to bring it to us today?
in some ways it was like impulse because, the question was asked, like, what was the fundamental book? And probably the easiest thing I could have done is say something that like is the most boring archetypal like answer in this regard, which is, Stephen King. Like I read all the Stephen King when I was a kid. And I did, and I've said that many, many times. And it really is true. Like I consumed so much of it when I was younger. It's like almost indistinguishable from my childhood. But when I really thought about it, there was also like I saw all these films with my friend I was talking about earlier when I was a kid, Nightmare on Elm Street, we watched a million of those. And that probably did it too. But I sat down, I thought about it when the question came to me, and I was like, no, the earliest exposure I had was Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark because I was 9, 11, something like that. And I wasn't very, like, this was elementary school, and I wasn't really great at school except English. I made great grades in English because I was obsessed. So, and I read and read and read and read in every class, whether I was supposed to or not. So I remember they put me in this separate reading group for people who were like good at words. And this was like the thing that they had us read. And I was like, I just remember being absolutely obsessed with it, absorbed. And I reread the whole second book, like I said last night, and I was remembering too the illustrations. They completely fucked with me. And in fact, there's an illustration that's not in this book of a woman with like spiders coming out of her face that has never left me.
Yeah, Stephen Gammell's illustrations are key to these books for a lot of people, to the point that a few years ago they were reprinting, they were doing a new edition, and they hired a different artist to do new
Oh no.
illustrations. And everyone rebelled and said, no, 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 you can't change. We have to have those original illustrations. They're so
God,
wonderful
yes.
and so evocative. I am thrilled to hear that this was a signed reading, because like I also got put in the gifted and talented like reading and writing groups in school, and they would not have let us touch scary stories to tell. Now it was around. I mean, I grew up in that era of the Scholastic book fairs and the Troll book fairs and all that. So Goosebumps was everywhere. Scary Stories was everywhere. But as I have previously said on this show, I was not allowed to read those things as a kid. I didn't get to them until much later because my parents were very like, no, 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 it's just going to freak him out. Don't give him that. So, what do you remember anything about like the why it was assigned reading and what you talked about or anything like that?
Well, number one, I look young, but I am very old. And so I think it was like I'm a Gen Xer, and they did not give two shits what they had you read. Like, as long as it was going to make you read. And they were like, cool, scary stories, that'll make them read. And my parents, they were annoyed with how much I read because it was getting me in trouble all the time. Like, I'd stay up late and read. I was reading in math class, I was reading in science class. So they were like, stop it, like, I didn't do my homework, I read. But at the same time, I don't ever remember once my parents saying, and my parents were readers to be clear, and they're probably why I'm a reader, I'm sure. Oh, what are you reading? Or I don't know if that's appropriate. And I probably had covers with like, because all I read fantasy, sci-fi, and then I read horror, and then I went back to sci-fi briefly, and then I went all straight literary fiction because all of that was bad, right, for years, which I regret. And so I don't remember ever my parents having an issue with that. And then again, I think honestly, this was just seen as books that we would actually read and that we'd have fun reading, right? And I did. I loved them, so yeah. And also the other thing I was remembering, I Googled around on this. I was trying to remember if the girl with the green ribbon was in this series, and it's not, and yet people remember it so because there was another adjacent scary series that they had us read. So they were just pumping us full of inappropriate horror literature at my school, my little tiny mountain town school.
Yeah, it definitely was a thing in the air where once scary stories hit, there were anthologies everywhere. But this remains the gold standard. I think the illustrations are a big part of that, but I also think that one of the defining characteristics, other than Schwartz's ability to like curate and give us sources for many of these stories, is the aspect of they came with stage directions, which I think is part of why I never got to experience this as a kid. But I reading them now, I'm like, oh, I understand why everyone was obsessed, because it wasn't just here are some scary stories. It was here is how you can fucking freak your friends out with this thing that I'm
Yes.
showing you. Did you use that to your advantage? Do you remember?
No, because I really didn't have friends, and so there was no one to do this to. I I occasionally had another kind of geeky friend, but my problem was, kind of a weird home life, and so I was kind of a weird kid, and I liked to read, which is weird, and so I often, like I wasn't really like, how like nerds are friends with nerds and they read comic books. I was more of a loner. But every once in a while I'd find a geeky friend and we'd geek out together in some way, shape, or form. But no, although I see people doing this to me very effectively. Like this was probably done to me. I didn't even remember the stage directions until I read it again last night. And I find that really funny. Like this is how you can fuck with your friends. And you're 8 and you're supposed to do that. That really cracks me up.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I've told this story on the show before, but it was in October, so fuck it, I'm gonna tell the story again. Um, I did not experience any of these stories directly from the book until I was older, but when I was probably 5 or 6 years old, it was Halloween, and our PE teacher told us, and I like you, I come from a very small town in Texas, very small school, and I was also kind of the weird kid who was into the stuff that the other kids weren't really into, and so it was kind of hard to like find common ground in these things. But our PE teacher told us basically her spin on the Golden Arm story, which is very
Oh, yeah.
standard classic scary story. And she did the thing at the end with the stage direction where it's something about it's you, and she reached out, and I remember there were maybe 20 of us sitting on the grass outside, and she said, and she did that, and we all screamed, and she went, okay, now run to the fence and come back. And we all took off running, and it was my first, like, I wasn't allowed horror at home, and it was like my first real scare. And I
Yeah.
remember it was a great thing for her to say run to the fence and come back, because I had this moment of just like running and feeling the adrenaline of that and going like, what is this? This is interesting. I remember going back to her and going like, was that real? Was that a story? Did that actually happen? And she said, no, it's a ghost story. It's just it's a ghost story, Matthew. And I was like, yeah, but where did it come from? And I don't know. It's just a ghost story. And all of these stories have that quality to them, that they just sort of feel plucked from the ether and designed to ratchet those emotions up in us, which I find amazing. So you mentioned rereading the second one, which I think is just called More Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Uh,
I think
why was
so.
that? Why was that the one you went back to? Did you remember specific stories from it that you wanted to check out?
Yes, the the cover, I was like, yes, yes, I know I read this one. I know I remember stories. And for some reason, even though I was almost skipping through the poems, It was and I think this was because people did repeat this in school. It was the worms go in, the worms go out. That is the thing that stuck. I remembered really being obsessed with that. And probably because of its lyrical quality, but also just I've always been like a little bit afraid of I'm a little bit claustrophobic, and it was not helped when I have had all these knee surgeries. And so they put you in MRIs and it's just like really tight. And so there's just certain horror that I'm like, nope, we're out, like anything to do with animals, any claustrophobia, I'm out, medical horror, I'm off and out. Um, and so that particular poem, I think my obsession late at night when I was a kid after reading it over and over and over and over was the idea that you'd be like conscious and buried, right? And yet rotting. And so I was like, oh, this is the worst thing in the world. And now I'm obsessed with it.
That is, it was funny. It's funny that you went back to this specific volume, because this one also has, I think it's in book two, my favorite of the stories, which is, I think it's called Clinkety Clink. I always get it's an onomatopoeic sound, so I always get that mixed up. But it's basically a variation of the Golden Arm story. It's just there's an old woman dies, and to keep her eyes closed, they put silver dollars on her eyes, and then when they bury her, someone takes the silver dollars and pockets them, and then of course she comes
Right.
back looking for her silver dollars, and it's just, I have always had a fear, because like I said, I grew up small town country, and if you live in a rural area, the dark is really dark. And
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
not necessarily that I'm scared of the dark, it's that I'm scared of any sound in the dark that I can't explain. So I'm always
Oh,
playing
yeah.
detective with any noise, and so the idea of the clinkety clink of coins signaling that a ghost is coming absolutely freaks me out. Um,
Yeah, I don't know. Well, see, I grew up in the woods. So yeah, we were constantly like, there is shit out there. For example, like there was a man who was killed by a bobcat in my high school. So we were very aware of like what was in the woods and what could absolutely kill you. And we were like trained, what do you do when a bobcat comes? What do you do when a bear comes? What do you do? And like, so definitely. And just the strange, like I'm rewatching Twin Peaks right now. I'm a huge Lynch
mm,
fan. And so, obviously he's been on my mind ever since he died. And I'm rewatching Twin Peaks, and like the way that there's something terrifying and beautiful, right, about the way he mythologizes the woods, and the way you're kind of going not just into this frightening, mysterious place, but that it has some otherworld quality to it. I just love that.
yeah, it's we could totally pivot right now and just talk about Twin Peaks, because I have not rewatched it. I've been rewatching Lynch films since he passed, but it's never too far from my mind. I think my Funko Pop Dale Cooper is on the shelf behind me, sitting up there with his cup of coffee. Uh, oh gosh, now I forgot what I was going to ask about scary stories, because now I'm just thinking about Twin Peaks.
I'm sorry about that.
No, 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 no. One thing that occurs to me, and I like, one thing that comes up over and over again on this show as authors come and bring their foundational, fundamental horror stories, is so often they talk about them in this reverential way of like, oh, this was just always kind of part of my life. And then I ask, what ways did this how did this find its way into your fiction later? And they go, well, now that you mention it, I guess it kind of did. In thinking about your fiction and scary stories to tell in the dark, I'm thinking a lot about haunted objects, which is something that came up in Whitehorse and comes up again uh, in Haunting of Room 904. It was scary story, and you mentioned like going on eBay and looking for haunted mirrors and things like that. Do you collect those things?
No, because there's some part of me that actually is scared, even though I mainly don't believe.
Okay, okay, but we share a fascination. We were talking about this earlier with haunted objects, cursed objects, that kind of stuff, and it's all through scary stories to tell in the dark. Whether we're talking about silver dollars that belong to a dead woman, or any number of other weird things. going on. And is that something that you trace back to this? Has that always been a thing that you found? I mean, you mentioned the family connections to Ouija boards and things like that. So I'm curious where that comes from for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to deviate to Twin Peaks for 2 seconds just to say Kyle MacLachlan has the funniest TikTok, the most amazing TikTok account I have ever seen. It is so goddamn funny
He
and just
does,
great and
yes.
weird. He's so funny. So,
Yes.
yeah, that's a great question. I think that, what it does it trace back to this? That's a great question. I think that if you're talking about objects of mystery, that probably traces back to my like earlier than horror roots, which is fantasy. Fantasy was probably the first genre that I was absolutely enamored of. And it was really funny because I was on a conglomerative podcast with Ellen Datlow once, and I said, I'm kind of like, as a horror writer, I'm kind of a fantasy geek. And you could tell she was like, ew, that is just not her. But me, it is. And so in fantasy, talismans, objects of mystery, objects of power, they, bracelets, swords, whatever, they are going to define you and lead you on the journey and quest of your life, right? That's going to tell you who you are and what your mission is, and it's going to change your life. So that's probably where that comes from. I think for me, in this particular, the tales, scary stories to tell in the dark, it is it's just the pleasure out of being afraid that I get and that I want to give. I know that sounds perverse, but like you said earlier, there is just something to it. Like I personally, why I loved Incidents Around the House so much was because it helped me sleep. And it's part of like things like this, films and books like this help me sleep. And people are always like, that makes no sense. It is because if something scares me in that fundamental way, it's sort of like an adult like ticket into Narnia because it's couched in horror, which is a little bit realism. You kind of believe that could be true, and you're like, ooh, maybe supernatural things do exist. That's number one. But number two, if something really profound you, like literally makes you jump, you can't think of anything else. You can't think of all of your problems, your career stuff, your personal stuff. You can't think. It just takes that away. So anything that can do that for me, I value. And this book, when I was a kid, absolutely did that for me. Probably the first thing that did that for me. So
This is very funny. Like we are friends now, Erica, because I feel the same way about horror helping me sleep. It is absolutely something that I I go into those stories like before I go to bed, and it is the I mean you explained it just then better than I ever could, but I don't know that it's perverse to love to terrify other people. I just think it's interesting. Does it I'm curious about this from the approach of like craft and how you approach scaring people, because look, there's stuff in Haunting of Room 904 that I can't talk about because I don't want to spoil it for readers, but I will be thinking about for a while. Um, do you scare yourself as you're writing, or is it just purely the fun of invention for you?
sometimes a little bit. I think it's hard to do that, and you have to kind of get it from other people. This just always sounds salacious when I talk about it, but you know what I mean? But I try to. And sometimes I listen to, actually, in order to get myself in that space, I listen to the soundtrack for Fire Walk with Me. That actually, the one, the Black Dog Walks at Night, scares me every time I listen to it, and it helps me get in that space to try anyway to do the same. And so, like, I will sometimes finish a chapter and be like, ugh, you know. But yeah,
That's amazing. That is Fire Walk with Me is my favorite Lynch film, and the score is a big Angelo Badalamenti, obviously a genius. I said that on a
yeah.
podcast recently, that Fire Walk with Me was my favorite Lynch film, and they said, "Oh, that's bleak, Matthew." And I said, "Listen, the more I watch that movie, the more I'm convinced that there is hope in it, and like tremendous. There is a tremendous sense of uplift by the end of that movie if you understand what's really going on there. At least for me."
Oh yeah, that's always Lynch. He goes as dark as he can to to say this is truly what exists. and you have to face it in order to transcend to the hope. Like that's how that works in Lynch, I think, you know. So, but I'm with you. I love
Yes.
that. I love fireworks.
We've talked before on this podcast about, and you just alluded to it in talking about how horror helps you sleep, that horror can be a wonderful coping mechanism because it's sort of an emotional and psychological practice, right? With the idea that
Hmm.
this scares me, but I'm at just enough of a remove that I understand this can't actually hurt me, so I'm just gonna let ride this out, and that can sort of prepare you for scary things in life. Now, I don't know how well that works because I am an anxious person who is scared on a fundamental level about a lot of things in the world right now. But I
Right.
do there is a pure cathartic satisfaction to being scared and then coming out the other side of it and going, "Oh, that was fun." As someone who does this for a living and who you mentioned like you have to get it from others when you talk about the scares in your books. Um, do you ever think of it in sort of lofty? You mentioned the word profound. I think what I'm trying to get at here is I feel, and you can agree or disagree, however you want to discuss this, but I feel as someone who writes horror and reads horror and watches horror that the emotional highs and lows and the cathartic, purely visceral experiences we can have with this stuff is enough. I don't feel like I have to explain it in any kind of academic term to make it sound loftier than it is. I really do think that there are magical experiences you can have in this genre without having to dig too deep into why. Um, what's your take on that?
I totally like Cynthia Pelayo has talked about this. Stephen Graham Jones wrote an article about it, and it's, you know, and I've included it in something for crime reads. It is true that it is cathartic, right? Like, so if you've experienced trauma, especially as a kid, it's a way of safely not going through it and being able to be like, oh, I can come out on the other side. So I do appreciate that. I really do. But I think, yeah, for me, it is probably a little more Lynchian in the sense that I want to experience the other world, even if it's only in fiction form. Now, if I really want to scare myself, I go back home and I just go back in the woods at night. Like, then I probably would have a goddamn heart attack and be totally sure that 50 supernatural bears are about to eat me. Like, so there are ways that I could, I suppose, accomplish that for real, which sound terrible. But I think like I guess that's what it is that I've seen enough, and even in the last couple of years, I've experienced enough trauma that I need to feel like I'm just not satisfied with something. If it's just like, no, life is really about happiness, you know, yes, but you know, it's not, you're not really happy. You're just pretending unless you're looking at all the dark stuff too. And I need to do that in order to feel like I can navigate my way through it to something else. But like you, there's a certain point in which it's a jump scare is fun. It is just fun, and that's okay. I think that a lot of academics, for example, are kind of like super hardcore Christians. They're really terrified of their emotions, and they don't like anything. Like, I've literally been in department meetings where I've had academic, you know, my peers say stuff like, "This book is dangerous because it just, you know, manipulates you," and I'm like, that is the job of a book. It is meant to manipulate you emotionally. It is doing that. That is its job. And I think I find that particularly interestingly American and puritanical. Like, we can't feel joy, we can't feel fear in fiction, we can't, you know, or otherwise it's not good or it's not smart. And I just find that that's just not where I'm at as a writer. So, or reader.
You touched on something a minute ago that came up when Eric LaRocca was on the show. And he was talking very eloquently about the ways in which he depicts the lives of depraved, often just terrible people doing terrible things to each other. And you and Eric's books are very different, but you touched on something that I think you share, which is this idea, and it is very Lynchian, and it is, I think, even if you want to dig into the appeal of scary stories to tell in the dark, because these stories are in many cases centuries old in some form or another, is this idea that our depravity and our darkness is not extant from our humanity. And I think White Horse is a great example of a book that excavates all of that darkness in a really powerful, interesting way. It's also very fun. It has all the horror elements, but like you said, there is something. It all rings false if you cannot take the darkness and the light simultaneously. Um, was that something that I like talking about the way that kids come to horror and the way that horror works in a child brain, in part because I didn't experience it that often as a kid. But you mentioned trauma, your own personal trauma, and we don't need to get too deep into that. But um, how does this idea of holding the dark and the light equally in your mind work for you when you have all this stuff personally in your mind, and then you bring it to the page and you're obviously charting the course of characters navigating the same thing? Is it therapeutic for you? Is it how does that all work together in your head, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think there can't be any horror or really any plot in fiction without some trauma, right? That's how you make the story go. So to me, even if you've written the most literary fiction book in the world, there is some baseline trauma that the character is either trying to get out of or not trying to get out of. So, especially if you're like very literal and literary and you're more into what you call the spiral plot and the traditional structured like plot. But all that said, even you take someone like Rachel Harrison, I think she is just a master writer because, I think she's even said herself, like, sure, I guess I'm cozy horror, but she's absolutely a feminist writer who is capable of looking at big things that, push women around and men around too, and sort of like translating it in such a way that it's still a propulsive read. And so I think there's something to that. Now, Eric is just, much more visceral, right? That's just what he is compelled to do as a writer. But I think as far as therapy goes, like I'm curious to see what they would say just because they're so different. For myself, I can't, I think that you can't use art as therapy if you want it to be a communication with somebody else, if you want to craft it and create such a thing that is meant to be entertainment for somebody else. I think that or like, at least it can't be purely therapy, right? Because if it's meant to actually be art therapy, you need to like be respectful of the process your head's going through and what it needs, right? And that's not your first priority necessarily when you're writing a novel. Your first priority is crafting a piece for entertainment and or enlightenment. And so, but what I can say is that without being a novelist, I would be a very unhappy person. Like I'm curmudgeonly, but I'm Gen X. That is how I'm built. There's nothing I can do about that, right? But be morbidly funny to cope with it. But I'm not an asshole. And I feel like, part of that is because I've broken my life around it in many ways. Like I must write and I must write what I need to write in order to be sane. That is true. So,
I want to shift gears a little bit and ask about something that I sort of had to put a pin in my head, and I want to ask it before I forget. You mentioned going through different reading phases and going through a period where you only read literary fiction because you bought into the idea that the genre books were bad. Um, I don't know that I ever fully did that, but I definitely remember, and I think a lot of us do, having that period where you have to read the quote unquote important books, and you come away with good stuff. Like I came away from that period being a fan of Michael Chabon and Cormac McCarthy and all these other wonderful Joyce Carol Oates, all these other wonderful writers, um, who, by the way, like to traffic in genre in their own ways, which is probably why I was a fan.
right.
What what for you in going through that interesting arc and coming back around to horror. Having been through that whole literary phase, do you think it, you said you regret it, do you think it made you a better horror writer or just a different one?
I just think I could have been a writer writing things that I would have been more successful in my earlier in my life. And I think when I went to college, it was so out of fashion that when I said, well, I'm going to write my thesis on Stephen King, my friends were like, um, and as much as I am a stubborn personality and fought them, I internalized it. And there was no space for what we call speculative writing or crime writing. In grad school, I went to do my master's and then my PhD. And also, too, like being of indigenous descent, but not enrolled. I think I came and, having an alcoholic father, I came from this very serious background. And so literary fiction began to speak to these very serious things. And I was like, okay, I want to see what I can do in this regard. But I think like I realized, I read all the time, but there was such a low level of joy for me in it. And what this person I was sort of seeing was like, you should read Lev Grossman's The Magicians. And it sat on my shelf essentially to the point where, I was no longer seeing him and I was almost about to return it. And I opened it up and it was just like over. It was over. Like I was like, I'm done. I'm done. And I tried to read literary fiction afterwards. But then I read like Rendezvous with Rama. I started watching Doctor Who again after, because I used to watch it as a kid. And I basically, what happened is that proportion of literary or realism to what, people call speculative just became short, smaller, and smaller. And I hardly ever read unless I'm asked to blurb it. I just don't read it. I'm a little bored by it now. It just lacks something extra for me. And, at a certain point, I'm just a geek. But I think the other part of it is, literary fiction is very hemmed in. Like it's either academic or it's very postmodern, right? And you must be like that or you're not art, or it's the book club stuff where it has to have the happy ending. And so, and I'm not saying there's not a lot in between, but I'm just not interested in that. And I also think that there are bigger questions that we need to start, asking. They just made an android that has basically the equivalent of human bones and is psychic. There's an android now that is psychic and has human bones. We have bigger questions than the subject of someone's dying marriage. And it doesn't mean that those aren't important things too. Those are very human. There's probably going to be an android, a psychic android with human bones that has a dying marriage someday. So I totally get that. But there are some big things happening on the horizon, and they ask more interesting questions for me. So
How does your sort of your experience and your worldview now, as it relates to fiction, how has it impacted your sort of journey through academia? Does being the loud and proud enthusiastic genre writer, does it have drawbacks? Are you how is that feeling for you?
I hate to say this, but a lot of, I've been fighting for a remote, like my job to be remote. Now it's become a real fight. I got my first job when I was very young, in rural Illinois. And, I was kind of there for 10 years. And for them to generalize, and, some of my colleagues are very nice, but the problem isn't even that I'm genre or not genre. The problem is that I'm successful at all and that I don't want to live in Macomb, Illinois, right? And some of it's just corporate garbage because, much like is happening with our government now, they're trying to fire everybody who isn't remote because as they shrink, they want to save money. So that's a bigger problem. And then I'm trying to get, an academic job somewhere else, but I'm not sure I fit into that anymore. But I need a steady income and insurance. So, but I do think what's funny about academia is that now every once in a while they'll be like, okay, speculative, whatever it is, it seems to be popular and that sounds smart. So we'll have a speculative position. But I think the problem with academics is they don't always necessarily know what that means. Like they think it might be, is that sci-fi? Is that magical realism? And so, and the writers that I, think of as successful speculative authors are much like me. They're around my age too. Matt Johnson, Victor LaValle, Stephen Graham Jones, all of them got their jobs before they started doing speculative and started becoming really successful. And that is some of the problem with academia is it's sort of, with the lack of tenure track jobs and so much of it being adjuncts, right? It's just hard to get these jobs. And so they get more and more and more and more fearful and cloistered and small about what they think is art and will accept. So yeah, I mean, I think I'd much rather write for Hollywood at this point, but we'll see.
In terms of your students, we talked a little bit earlier about your perspective shifting and your focus on giving them the tools they need to move forward as creative writers. What in the current, I don't want to say the current climate, because the current climate will change by the time this episode goes up, because it changes every 6 minutes now. But knowing now what you know as someone who has been through, we've talked about your reading journey, we've talked about your history with horror, we've talked about your writing. As someone who has two novels out now, more on the way, what are the most important tools that you're hoping your students and young creative writers are carrying with them?
Yeah, I used to be like every other creative writing teacher. I used to be like, well, no genre, there's nothing wrong with it, but I don't know how to teach it. And I just want you to build the basic bones. I have crashed that completely. I don't do that. In fact, I teach even in my intro class, I teach one realism story by Holly Goddard Jones, who's a very underappreciated novelist. Her books, The Salt Line, was an amazing science fiction novel that I wish everyone would read. So I teach one of her stories. It's realism. I teach a crime story by Walter Mosley, and I teach a sci-fi story by Rebecca Ronhorst, so they can see how these different genres function and the way they function the same. And I think all those three pieces are all literary. But the thing that I think that I've tried to do the most is in my senior level, advanced creative writing, and on when I teach graduate classes, when I've done that historically, I build it around the novel. I say, look, if you're writing a collection, if you write short stories, there's nothing wrong with that. We can readjust. But people do not teach people how to write the novel, even in the MFAs. And so what I do is I have them read Ring Shout, because I love it, because it's like multi-genre. It's literary, it's sci-fi, it's fantasy, it's horror. And it's just masterful in like 120 pages. And I have them read the beat sheet from Save the Cat Writes a Novel. And then I have them do a beat sheet for Ring Shout. Then I have them do a beat sheet for their own novel. And then I have them do chapter one, right? And we just workshop chapter one, because people need to come out of, especially MFAs, with some ability to write a novel, because that's what people generally want to write. And I love short stories and I love short story collections. And if that's what they want to do, yes. But countless people have come out of these programs and been like, I don't know how to do this. And so for me, it's like, my job is to change that. So
This is interesting, because one thing that something that Ray Bradbury used to talk about all the time is he would encourage people to, you have to learn to write short stories so you can write a novel. And I think the practice of writing fiction daily, which was also something that he was a proponent of, is certainly valuable. But I was always sort of puzzled by that advice, because I was always kind of like, but it's so different doing the two things. Um, why do you think it is that MFA programs have sort of lost that approach to, here is how you get behind the wheel of something as big as a novel and steer it?
they never had it for a variety of reasons. And I wanted to believe that if you learn to write a short story really well, that's how you would learn to write a novel, because Freytag's triangle is usually there, right? Unless you're very anti-narrative. And again, that's fine. And there are also, beyond anti-narrative and traditional narrative, there are countless alternative structures. There's a great blog, by the way, called Ingrid's Notes. It talks about alternative structures and alternative plots in very concrete terms I constantly recommend. But they never had it. And it's because, like, most of the time, right, when these programs really started to take off in the 80s and 90s, even the early aughts to a degree, although less so, what was happening was, if you were a successful novelist, you were getting big advances potentially. Not always, of course, you were big advances, and you were probably touring a bit, and you didn't necessarily have to go teach in a creative writing program to make money. And you could potentially go to Hollywood, which is still, sometimes, depending on the situation, an option. But then the advances started to get smaller, right? And a lot of people, like if you were writing a short story collection, you weren't necessarily going to get a big advance. So you're going to go into these programs and teach, right? And then on top of the advances get smaller, right? So now the programs were kind of structured in the 80s and 90s around short story writers who taught short stories. And it was like also like you could just bite off a little piece, right? You wouldn't have to like a lot of I've talked to a lot of creative writing professors and like, well, how do we do it? And so that's why I have a very like, this is how we do it. Because it's just easier to go in and they kind of did in the time in the 80s and the 90s, just go in and read a story on the fly, give some offhanded critique, go home and write your novel, write your story, your third short story collection, right? And now, I think it's time to like destroy that model a little bit and say, okay, there are other ways. Are there other ways to do this? How would we teach a crime novelist? How would we teach a science fiction novelist? How should we teach structure? Is there more than just traditional Hollywood and anti-narrative, whatever that means to somebody? And there are. And I feel like I wish there were MFA programs that like really broke that down and restructured because it can be done. It can be done. So yeah.
Before we go, because we've been talking about Twin Peaks a lot, I just want to nerd out about Twin Peaks for a second. Do you have a favorite episode? Could you even begin to name one? Because I struggle with that.
I rewatch Twin Peaks every like 3 or 4 years. I watched it first in grad school, and then I watched it again like 10 years ago, and now I'm watching it again. And of course, the Twin Peaks like reboot is so fucking weird, it's hard to even talk about. Like, it was the most visually compelling thing of his I think I've ever seen,
Hmm.
but I would have to rewatch it to know what in God's name he was trying to say. It actually weirdly reminds me of, and someone's going to laugh here, of The Cell. The Cell is one of my favorite horror movies, but people make fun of it because Jennifer Lopez is in it. And it's a great film. I watch it several times a year because it's so visually disturbing and arresting at the same time. And beautiful, both of them are. The first Twin Peaks, in some ways, the pilot's my favorite because
Mm.
it has all these iconic moments, like Laura Palmer's. This is sad to say or gross to say, but like the body and the plastic, the first time you see her face, the first time you're introduced to all these characters, and of course, the second half of Twin Peaks is completely written by Mark Frost, and Lynch was kind of not writing anymore for it, and so it's a little more soap operatic. But I would say like really anything in the first 5 to 10 episodes, however many there were, I can't even remember, would be any one of them could be my favorite. Like it holds up so well, it's ridiculous.
It does. It's fortuitous that we are talking about this. This is the day, February 24th, that Dale Cooper enters the town of Twin Peaks. So
Oh,
we actually it was at 11:30 a.m. too, which was like 30 minutes ago. So like we talked through Twin Peaks
oh,
time, which is yeah.
oh my God, that's
Someone
wonderful.
someone shared that on Blue Sky last night, and I was like, "Oh, Twin Peaks Day." But yeah, if you still haven't seen Twin Peaks, listeners, the pilot of Twin Peaks is an incredible establishing. It you can learn so much about like how to set a tone from watching that episode, and then you'll want to keep watching because it's just so weird and wonderful. Do you have a favorite like side, however you want to interpret this, your favorite like side character, your favorite supporting character in the whole ensemble?
Yeah, and if I think about it, probably I was just thinking about this and rewatching it. Probably my favorite episode is when McLaughlin's character enters, what is it called? My gosh, not the Dark House. Gosh, what is the other role
The
called?
Black Lodge.
The Black Lodge, yes, which is
Yeah.
so great. If I really think about it, but yeah, I kind of want to say it's Michael Horse's character, right? Because he's the native character, even though he's so hilariously stereotypical.
Yeah.
Um, gosh, who would be? I keep thinking about that, but I'm just going to vote Indigenous and say Michael Horse's character.
Yeah. I get he's not on the show all the time, but I love Lynch. I love Gordon Cole. The scenes of Gordon Cole realizing that he can hear Shelley Johnson it's still some of my favorite stuff in any TV show ever.
There's something about Lynch in those episodes and in real life. He's very, very charming with women, but you're never like, Is he a creep? I don't know how he accomplishes that, but he does, you know?
It's remarkable. Like he just sits there and is like, "Hey, so I'm gonna leave town, and I think I should kiss you before I leave town." Random waitress in diner, and you go, "Oh, that's so sweet."
That's
It's
darling. He
it's
just has a
amazing.
grandpa quality, even when he probably was born that way. You know what I mean? Like he's 13 and people are like, what a darling grandpa type guy.
He has that sense to him. I get the idea of David Lynch just being perpetually like, "I love coffee," just his entire life.
Yeah, like if he was born in a different space, you can see the guy just being like somebody's unbelievably weird, charming uncle, you know?
You have been listening to the official Twin Peaks podcast with Matthew Jackson and Erika T. Wurth. No, we may have to have you back sometime just to talk about Twin Peaks. We may have to put together a whole like special episode just about Twin Peaks because between you and when Haley Piper was here, we talked about Twin Peaks a lot too because of all the hearts you eat. But yeah, the Twin Peaks scary stories to tell in the dark. Our guest is Erika T. Wurth. Erika, before we let you go, will you let everyone know where they can find you online?
Yes, pretty much ErikaTWurth is at that as everywhere. I probably am the most active on Instagram though.
All right. Erika T. Wurth, it has been our guest. The book, The Haunting of Room 904, is out March 18th. You should get it. It's amazing. Erika, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much.
Thanks once again to Erika T. Wurth for being on the show. The Haunting of Room 904 is available now wherever books are sold. It's fantastic. Go pick it up. If you have not read Erika's previous novel, White Horse, came out a couple years ago. One of my favorite horror novels of the last 5 years. Fantastic stuff. Go pick that up. Erika's great. Follow her online, buy her books. If you want to keep track of us online, the best way to do that is to follow us on social media. Right now, we're mostly at Blue Sky. We're kind of sunsetting our Twitter account for obvious reasons, but we're at scareshapedus.bsky.social on Blue Sky. We are also still on Facebook. If you search The Scares That Shaped Us, you should find us there. I'm probably going to be getting in some other stuff up and running here soon, but you probably won't know about that if you're not following us on Blue Sky. So go find us on Blue Sky. We are also on YouTube. We're The Scares That Shaped Us on YouTube. If you prefer to get your podcast on YouTube, every episode is up over there. We also have a website, thescareστhatshapedus.com, where you can find links to our socials and ways to contact me, and supposedly an archive of episodes, but I really need to update the website. I got it mostly as a placeholder. I need to make it a better placeholder. Working on it, folks. And if you want to email me about anything, if you have a suggestion, a question, anything, like seriously, if you have a question about horror stuff that you want me to talk about on the show, or you want book recommendations or movie recommendations or anything like that, I am happy to always talk about things like that. You're welcome to email me any future guests that you would like to see, anything like that. Happy to read everybody's emails. And that does it for us this week. We will be back next week, March 26th, with a brand new episode. Our guest will be Nat Cassidy, who is going to talk to us about his new novel, When the Wolf Comes Home, which is excellent. We're going to talk about a rather obscure short story from an out-of-print book that Nat was nice enough to send to me, the story, not the book, called The Burr Woman. And it's a super creepy story. We talk a lot about childhood fears. We talk a lot about monsters. We talk a lot about finding horror in unexpected places in pop culture growing up. It's a great time. Again, that will be March 26th at noon Central. So look for that then. Until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of each other. I am Matthew Jackson, and this is The Scares That Shaped Us.